hired my law firm in the spring of 2001 to handle what was called the roadless lawsuit. And I don't know how many of you remember, but one of the very last things that Bill Clinton did before he left office in 2001 was he signed what was called the roadless rule. And the roadless rule denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands throughout the United States. It was illegal. It was done illegally. It violated NEPA. It violated the Wilderness Act. It violated the Wyoming Wilderness Act. It violated the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. It violated the National Forest Act. It violated basically every federal law you can think of that relates to land use planning. But it was one of the highest priority items for the environmental groups, probably within the entire decade, well, several decades, from probably the early 1980s, actually late 1970s, up until the time when it was signed in 2001. We filed suit on behalf of the state of Wyoming, and while we were handling that lawsuit, what we found was that our federal government has really has gotten to the point that it abuses our laws and our regulatory process so intensely that it is coming to a point where it's just about to collapse our economy. Now, I know all of you have been watching the news. I know you're watching the debate on the debt limit. I know that you've been listening to and hearing about the regulatory impacts and what's happening in our country. But where I really learned what was going on with this was, again, when I found out what happened with the federal government in the 2001 roadless rule. And I'll just give you a little bit of background. The roadless rule was conceived with this idea that it was going to turn well over a third of our national forests into what we would refer to as wildlands or wilderness areas. Because the executive branch does not have the authority to do that, only Congress could designate wilderness areas. They did this through what was called the roadless rule. They went through a regulatory process to do it. And they had a rulemaking that lasted just a little bit over a year. Now, anybody who has ever dealt with the federal government and had to deal with the NEPA process knows that nothing happens in a year. And essentially what we found out was that this rule had been written before it was even announced. That in the fall of 1999 is when the roadless rule was written, and they just went through the pro forma process of getting it put in place after that. But the way that they did that is they completely distorted the public process for doing so. For example, there were 1.2 million comments that were submitted on the roadless rule. It was the largest rulemaking in the history of the United States. Over 90% of those comments were form comments that came in from the environmental groups. For example, there's a hair care product, hair and makeup care. It's called Aveda. They're out of Minnesota. You see them in spas and things like that. If you bought a bottle of shampoo from Aveda, you could get a postcard that was directed to the United States Forest Service, and it said, "Please protect our heritage forests. Please pass the roadless rule. We love this idea." They received 89,000 postcards from Aveda hair care products. It was a completely distorted process. One of the other things that they did is that they were having public meetings. And I would read the reports from these public meetings, say in Lander, Jackson, Laramie, all of these places in Wyoming where I knew the vast majority of people were opposed to the roadless rule. But they would say there was 100 people that would show up, and 98 of them were in favor of the roadless rule. And I thought that those statistics were very, very strange. They didn't make sense to me. Well, one of the things we were able to do in that case was we got a hold of the environmentalist records. And what they did is they paid people. They paid operatives. They literally bussed people into Laramie or Lander. They bussed people into these areas. And when they would walk in the door in a room like this for the public meeting, there would be a sign-up sheet. There would be a clipboard with a sign-up sheet for whoever was going to speak. And they would take that clipboard and they would only give it to their own people. So that anybody who was opposed to the roadless rule, they ran out of time so that they were not allowed to speak. This was a process that they were using that we were able to expose because, again, we were able to get a hold of their documents. But what they did is they completely distorted the actual public process associated with the roadless rule. So when we were challenging, when we were in front of Judge Brimmer, who was our federal district court judge in Cheyenne, one of the things that I was just constantly beat over the head about was them saying we received 1.2 million comments and 95% of the people supported it. 95% of the people supported the roadless rule. Judge, this is the way that the process works. There were 65,000 substantive comments submitted on that rule, and the vast majority of those were opposed to it. And what we did is we focused Judge Brimmer on those comments. And we talked to him about the substantive comments and the people from the Department of Ag and the State Engineer's Office and the Governor's Office. And we had very, 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 very good letters from people throughout the United States that talked about that rule. And what we found was that's what was persuasive with Judge Brimmer. He didn't care about the 1.2 million comments. He said all of that was just a postcard campaign. It doesn't matter to me. I want to know what the people who know had to say. And that's when we started realizing that we have got to participate in this public process if we are going to be successful at stopping these types of activities. So one of the things that Kara and I soon thereafter started was we started an organization called the Wyoming Conservation Alliance. And the whole purpose of that organization was to try to get people more actively involved in the regulatory process so that we can start challenging and pushing back on these things. The fact is that the environmental groups have been working since the 1960s. They have been working since the 1960s to stop you from ranching, to stop you from using federal lands, to stop you from grazing, to stop our farming activities. They have been using, they have come up with everything from the Endangered Species Act to NEPA to the Wilderness Act to all of these different acronyms that I can come up with. They have been working for 40 years to try to find a way. And all of us have been so busy at raising kids and raising livestock and raising crops and participating in our community and being actively involved in organizations like this and running the county fair and running the state fair. And we've been so busy with all of that, making society run the way that it has. We have been so busy creating a prosperous country that we failed to realize what was going on behind the scenes. And in the last 15 years, it has been a push like none of us have ever seen in our lives in terms of trying to change our country and stop you from doing what you're doing. And we have to wake up. We as an industry, our ag industry, our cattle groups, our other livestock groups, our farming groups, we have got to wake up and start participating and start pushing back. Because what I realized when I handled these lawsuits, and I've handled quite a few of them, such as the roadless rule, last year we actually won the wolf lawsuit. After 9 years, we got a federal district court judge to say that the Fish and Wildlife Service was wrong to reject Wyoming's wolf management plan that allows us to manage wolves as predators. We have some successes, and when we fight these battles, we can win them. I am convinced that most judges really do believe the way that we believe. It is just that they have been inundated for so long from the other side that they haven't always heard from us. They have not always had our story told. They haven't understood necessarily all of the impacts that have been happening in this country and what is really fundamentally changing our country. So what Kara and I did is we realized that if we were going to participate and we were going to fight back on these things, we can't only do it through litigation. And what we've also found is that our government is now just so completely out of control in terms of regulations that if we don't find a way to push back on this, we aren't going the way of Greece. We're well beyond where Greece is. This is the Federal Register, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Federal Register. And some, I see a few of you. The Federal Register is what is published every day. This is where all of the federal regulatory actions are published and identified. So the Federal Register has everything that is happening with any federal agency. Department of Education, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, Department of Ag. Any type of federal action, any type of federal activity that's taken by the executive branch, not the legislative branch, but the executive branch, President Obama and his agencies, any action that is taken by that is published in this book. Every single